We're going to decorate the church after service today, and we're going to put this little set of dolls up here. And made me think about, why do we have a set of dolls on the communion table at Christmas time? Why do people do this? And I'm going to ask you an actual question that you can actually answer. Why do we do this? What do you think?
I think to remember.
To remember.
Sort of tells the story visually.
Mm-hmm. Well, today we're going to find out where this strange custom came from. It is kind of a strange custom when you think about it. Did it come from the Bible? We say we follow the Bible and as our rule and our authority. Did this come from there? Is it actually even Christian? There's another question. It's like the Christmas tree. That has nothing to do with Christianity whatsoever. It's a pagan symbol, and of course Christians all through history have accommodated pagan symbols and made them Christian so we could continue enjoying the custom. But this one, it looks more Christian anyway, and so we're going to find out about that. But first of all, we have to read the Christmas stories, there's 2 of them, and kind of take inventory. Who was at that stable, and when were they there, and what was there that we should put on this table? And so go over to Luke 2, 4 to verse 20. And this is a picture, I like this by an artist a long time ago. Look at all that's going on up there. We've got angels, we've got shepherds, lots of things going on. And lots of people from the neighborhood, it looks like. This was Joseph's hometown, right? Would Mary really have given birth by herself? I don't think so. So anyway, all the people in town are there, and the angels and everybody. Okay, let's read this. And Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and family line of David, to be registered along with Mary, who was engaged to him and was pregnant. While they were there, the time came for her to give birth. Then she gave birth to her firstborn son, and she wrapped him snugly in cloth and laid him in the feeding trough, because there was no room for them at the lodging place. In the same reason, shepherds were staying out in the fields, keeping watch at night over their flock. Then the angel of the Lord stood before them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. But the angel said to them, "Don't be afraid." You know, angels say this every time they appear to humans. We just are scared of angels. So they have to say, "Don't be afraid, for look, I proclaim to you good news of great joy that will be for all the people. Today, a Savior, who is Messiah the Lord, was born for you in the city of David. This will be the sign for you. You will find a baby, wrapped snugly in cloth, and lying in a feeding trough." And suddenly there was a multitude of the heavenly host with the angel praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest, and peace on earth to people he favors." When the angels had left them and returned to heaven, the shepherds said to one another, "Let's go straight to Bethlehem and see what's happened, which the Lord has made known to us." So they hurried off and found both Mary and Joseph and the baby who was lying in the feeding trough. After seeing them, they reported the message they were told about this child, and all who heard it were amazed at what the shepherds said to them. But Mary was treasuring up all these things in her heart and meditating on them. The shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all they had seen and heard, just as they had been told. All right, so that's the stable, that's the crèche, and now we find out about the wise men. That's in Matthew 2, 1 to 11. And we'll find out how many there are, maybe? Do we know how many there were? Here we go. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, notice that after. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of King Herod, wise men from the east arrived unexpectedly in Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was deeply disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. So he assembled all the chief priests and scribes of the people and asked them where the Messiah would be born. "In Bethlehem of Judea," they told him, "because this is what was written by the prophet, 'And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means the least among the leaders of Judah, because out of you will come a leader who will shepherd my people Israel.'" Then Herod secretly summoned the wise men and asked them the exact time the star appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go search carefully for the child. When you find him, report back to me so that I too can go worship him." After hearing the king, they went on their way. And there it was, the star they had seen in the east. And it led them until it came and stopped above the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they were overjoyed beyond measure. Entering the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and falling to their knees, they worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. I want you to notice it says they entered the house. Also, there we have the elements of the crèche. We have Mary, Joseph, and here's a little drawing of it. Mary, Joseph, baby Jesus, Bethlehem, shepherds, a star, and the wise men. But they weren't all at the stable. They weren't all there at the same time in Bethlehem. Wise men came to a house in Bethlehem. So it must have been some time later, but the Bible doesn't say how much later. They weren't, at any rate, at the stable. Notice there aren't any angels anywhere at the stable. Angels that sang to the shepherds went away. No angels. The star the wise men saw was not mentioned as hovering over the stable either. It just said it led the wise men to the house. No star. Took place in the stable, so maybe there were animals there. But the Bible doesn't say anything about it. So, what was at the Nativity? Joseph, Mary, baby Jesus, shepherds, a manger, and swaddling clothes. Anybody glowing? Nope. No glowing. Any angels? Nope. All right. I admit it. That's all hung up on historical accuracy, but we're not dealing with historical accuracy. It's a symbolic representation of the whole story. The crèche is. So let's include everything. Everything. Personally, I think there were even more people there, as I pointed out earlier. It was Joseph's hometown, and so he had a lot of relatives there, and let's face it, if there's a woman giving birth, the relatives are going to be there to help her out. The women were going to be helping Mary, and they probably even had a midwife there. And the men probably were with Joseph, because the men weren't supposed to be where the woman was giving birth. So Joseph and the male relatives were off somewhere worrying about Mary, as usual. The gospel doesn't include every detail. None of them do. Just the details that are pertinent to the point. And what's the point of the Christmas story? God became a baby. That's it. So all the other details are extraneous. And it's kind of fun to speculate, but you can't say it came from the Bible. But our crèche is a symbolic representation of the whole story. So let's see where this custom came from. Now, I found this to be quite interesting. The custom of making nativity scenes. Where did it come from? What's interesting is that at first in the history of the Christian church, Jesus' birth wasn't celebrated. His death was celebrated, but not his birth. Something happened. In fact, they considered the Epiphany, which is when the wise men came to the house, to be more important than the birth. So they celebrated Epiphany on January 6th. Here's the first depiction we have of that event. It's a sarcophagus from a Roman catacomb. It shows the wise men coming to the Christ child and his mother. Can you see them? I'll just point them out real quick. We got 1, 2, 3 wise men. And here's their gifts in their hands, and they got their camels. And here's Mary and the young boy, you notice? It isn't a baby. And a star. And this wise man's pointing at the star. Very early sarcophagus. That's our first one. Then in the 4th century, something happened that made the birth of Jesus important. And so people started to celebrate the birth. In the 4th century, that's 300 AD, it was the first Council of Nicaea, called together by the Roman Emperor Constantine in 325 AD. He called church leaders from all over the known world to come together and settle some issues that were splitting the church apart and were causing all kinds of confusion. In fact, there's a historian that I like to read. His name's Eusebius, and he was a writer at the time. He was there, Eusebius of Caesarea. And Nicholas of Myra, the legendary Santa Claus, was there. Interesting, isn't it? And some who still bore wounds from persecution. The persecutions of the Christians had only stopped 12 years before this. Interesting. So people with wounds were still there and scars. So why was this council called? For several reasons, but one very important reason was to nail down what the Bible taught about the nature of Christ. What did it mean that Jesus is the Son of God? What does that mean? The problem was that there were some leaders from Egypt, and they began to reinterpret the scriptures to say that Jesus was a created being, the most excellent of creations, created before the beginning of the earth, before the beginning of all the rest of the creation, and then God created everything else through Jesus, the Christ, who John calls the Word, who was in the beginning with God. Jesus was created. He had a beginning. He was not equal with the Father, nor was he eternal. That's what these church leaders in Egypt were teaching. It was called Arianism. And as far as I understand it, the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons both think of Jesus as a created being. So it continues today. Well, they had heated debates about this, as you can well imagine. And finally, this heresy was roundly condemned by the majority of the council. In fact, by the time they were done debating it, there was only 2 people who still wanted to hold to this, and the council exiled them and kicked them out of the empire to just stop this heresy. Of course, it didn't stop it, obviously. They decided that the Bible taught that Jesus, and here's that hymn we just sang, Jesus was begotten, not created. And did you notice the date of that hymn when it was written? 1200 something? And this was decided in the 300s. So Jesus then, begotten, not created, was of the same nature as the Father. They used the word substance, which doesn't make much sense to me, but it had to do with philosophical meaning of the word substance, I guess. But of the same nature as the Father, eternally equal with the Father. That's what the Bible taught. They finally decided. Therefore, you can see why the incarnation of Jesus was so important then all of a sudden. Because this is God now coming as a baby, begotten, not created. We still can't wrap our head around it, but that seems to be what the Bible teaches, and that's why it was important. Now, I talked about the Christmas tree not being a Christian symbol originally. Well, December 25th wasn't either. It's another pagan holiday. It was a celebration of the winter solstice, when the darkest time and the sun begins to grow again after that. So they had this celebration of the winter solstice. So the Western Christians of the Roman Empire decided that that was convenient, so they just appropriated it for the birth of Christ, to celebrate the birth of Christ. Not necessarily that Christ was born that day, but that's the day they wanted to celebrate it, the 25th. But in the East, the Eastern Church, by this time the church had been divided into two parts, and the Eastern Church still stuck with Epiphany, and so they celebrated the birth of Jesus. They added it to the wise men, and so they celebrated on January 6th. And so we still have a time of Epiphany in liturgical churches where they celebrate the coming of the wise men. Baptists don't go with the liturgical year usually so much. Some American Baptists do, but we don't necessarily. So that's Jesus' birth. Now let's zoom ahead. About 900 years to 1223. About the time our hymn was written. Christians in Italy were enjoying Christmas by this time, and they were enjoying it way too much, and for the wrong reasons. It was parties and gifts and dancing and music and feasting. It was a good time. The wrong reasons. It's just like today, isn't it? Yep, just the same. Not necessarily the birth of Jesus. St. Francis, you've heard of him, St. Francis of Assisi. Well, he'd gone on a trip to the Holy Land, and he got impressed there because he went to a celebration of Christ's birth in a cave. And that was supposed to be where Jesus was born, in this cave. And he was so impressed by this celebration in the cave that he wanted to reproduce it back home in Italy, where he lived. And so he began a celebration. It wasn't really a celebration. He tried to recreate this thing in order to remind people what the point of Christmas was. And I actually have an English translation of what his biographer wrote at the time. And it's rather flowery, and you have to listen to it with medieval ears. Here's what he wrote. It happened in the 3rd year before his death that in order to excite the inhabitants of Greccio to commemorate the nativity of the infant Jesus with great devotion, St. Francis determined to keep it with all possible solemnity. And lest he should be accused of lightness or novelty, he asked and obtained permission from the pontiff. Then he prepared a manger and brought hay, an ox, and an ass to the place appointed. The brethren, of course that's the Franciscan brothers, they were summoned, and the people ran together, and the forest resounded with their voices. It was an exciting time. And that venerable night was made glorious by many and brilliant lights and sonorous psalms of praise. The man of God, St. Francis, stood before the manger full of devotion and piety, bathed in tears and radiant with joy. Tears of joy on St. Francis' face. The Holy Gospel was chanted by Francis, the Levite of Christ. He's talking about him being a priest. Then he preached to the people around the nativity of the poor king, and being unable to utter his name for tenderness of his love, he called him the Babe of Bethlehem. A certain valiant and veracious soldier, Master John of Greccio, who for the love of Christ had left the warfare of this world and become a dear friend of this holy man, affirmed that he beheld an infant marvelously beautiful sleeping in the manger. So he had a vision. And the thing continues that the actual hay became miraculous, and animals, it was like the first veterinarian. The animals would go and be healed if they ate this hay that St. Francis had brought to the cave. I don't know how accurate that is, but maybe, who knows? God can do anything, right? Well, after that, you can see how exciting this nativity idea, and actually St. Francis was a living nativity where it was being acted out. But you can see how exciting this is to people, and so everybody starts doing this, and it became a big custom, very popular, and people added all the characters in the story, and the star and everything. Not everybody knows, they weren't all there at the same time, but it's the whole thing, it's the whole event of the incarnation. And the wise men and the angels and the donkeys and the cows and the chickens and the sheep, everybody was there. And of course, if someone paid to have this thing created, well, they wanted to be there too, so they were in the manger, in the stable, and particularly in paintings, the patrons were put in the stable. And eventually, these nativity scenes, I saw them on the internet, some of them, they include the whole village. Talk about a crowded stable. Everybody was there. Well, I think it's probably more accurate than our kind of lonely little Joseph, Mary, and a baby. I think it probably was all these people with them. But so interesting. Sometimes very strange figures work their way into these depictions of the Nativity. There's this one in the Catalonia region of Spain, the people began to include a young boy defecating. Nobody knows why. There's always this little guy. Today we might see snowmen. And I tried on the internet to find somebody who had made a crèche out of snowmen in their front yard. And nobody's taken a picture of doing that, so there's a challenge for you to do this winter. Make a crèche in your front yard of snow people. How about a rubber ducky nativity? There's two of them. And of course Santa's got to be in there somewhere. And here's some action figures. We got Batman, and we got the wise men are Darth Vader figures. I don't know what that means. And there's a dinosaur, and there's all kinds of things in there. Figures from Star Trek are Mary and Joseph. And I even found George W. Bush in one of these. He's one of the wise men. And this is by Madame Tussaud, how do you say it in Britain, the Wax Museum there. And I understand the Pope was not amused by this depiction. It caused quite an uproar, in fact. Tony Blair's in there, too. Well, you can see where this gets crazy. And craziness is just one of the problems of this thing. And the Puritans were also not amused with people having all these parties and celebrations and all this going on. So the Puritans banned Christmas celebrations altogether. And here's I got to read this to you. Well, they become holidays for parties and celebrations and all this kind of stuff. So the observation of Christmas having been deemed a sacrilege, the exchanging of gifts and greetings and dressing in fine clothing, feasting and similar satanical practices are hereby forbidden, with the offender liable to a fine of 5 shillings. And here's another posting of that. And it's the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And our forebear as Baptists had no end of trouble with these people. And so you can see why that might be. They're pretty strict. They don't want to have anything to do with Christmas at all. All right? You know, it's just the way we are. If humans are involved, it's going to eventually have something to do with fun. And, God knew that. And so the feasts of the Jews were fun. They had lots of food, and even their worship, when they'd bring their sacrifices, they didn't burn the whole animal up. They kept parts of it to eat and to feast, and God knew humans need this. Fun is okay. But the problem is that most often in our fun, the incarnation of Jesus is kind of ignored. In fact, it's hard to get people to even stop and think about it. Even be reminded of it, at least in my family. I've tried it a couple of times. My own family and my extended family, nobody wants to stop and sit there and listen to that Bible story they've heard a gazillion times. It's just a problem. We tend to forget. Get all caught up in our food and presents. It's just a similar issue to St. Francis and, well, I suppose to the Puritans too, right? birth of Christ seems to become a reason for all sorts of things having nothing to do with Jesus. And it's an old story over and over. That's what we do. Sometimes it's something to laugh at. Here's a crèche made out of Spam. Here's one made out of Coke cans. Now, it must have been in South America, because the names on them are, we have Jose and Jesus and Maria and Angel in a cardboard box. And the comments underneath this one were, good luck finding Coke cans with Melchior, Caspar, and Balthasar on them. And then, sure enough, somebody from Eastern Europe or somewhere said, in my country, we already have Coca-Cola cans with the names of the three wise men on them. So that's names that are common there. And, of course, somebody else said the three wise men came bearing gifts of caramel-colored caffeine and high-fructose corn syrup. And somebody else said, but wait, there's myrrh. See, I thought that was funny. Yeah. All right. And another one said the way this story ended was so depressing. So, sometimes the crèche can be a political statement. Here's U.S. Steel built this in response to the crèche being kicked out of the courthouse grounds in Pittsburgh. And so U.S. Steel wanted to make a statement. Or sometimes it's a contest. Maybe you've heard in the news that there's been a new Guinness World Record set for someplace in Utah. 1,039 participants in a living nativity set in Provo, Utah. Well, that's the crèche. Maybe we should get back to St. Francis. What do you think? Maybe we should get back to the reason for beginning these nativity sets and ask ourselves, how can we build up Christ to people around us in this season? In our own town or in our families. What would St. Francis say that we should do? We should act like Jesus. That's how you do it. You live for others. That's how you do it. That's one of the major messages of Christmas, isn't it? That's the whole point of giving gifts. That's the whole point of King Wenceslas and Santa Claus, although Santa Claus is kind of convenient because somebody else is giving gifts and I don't have to. Of course, we know it's a myth, but we should live for others. That's what the message is. That's what Jesus did. That's why he was born. To bless the world. And that's how we should celebrate Christmas, by blessing other people. And that's what we do, I think. We try. And that's why the crèche is important, because that's what God did. So you're right, Iris. The crèche is there. We do these little dolls on the table to remind us of what God has done for us. He became a baby to bless the world. And he expects us to bless others like he did. So that's what we should do. Bless other folks who need you. You know, we ought to thank Francis of Assisi. It's a good idea, that crèche.